The IMF World Economic Outlook, April 2026. The International Monetary Fund meets twice a year in Washington. Economists fly in, give speeches, publish a report, and politely tell the world that things are going badly. The world mostly continues going badly. This week, the IMF published its April 2026 World Economic Outlook. The title was Global Economy in the Shadow of War. They are not known for understatement. The forecast was not good. Global growth projected at 3.1% this year. Down from 3.4% just months ago. Not yet a recession. But close enough that the IMF bothered to define what a global recession is, which is the kind of thing you do when you want to be clear that you are not technically predicting a global recession while also making absolutely sure everyone is aware that one is possible. Here is how we got here. The IMF World Economic Outlook, what it is and why it matters. The IMF's World Economic Outlook is the closest thing the global economy has to an annual checkup. The doctor takes your blood pressure, looks at your lifestyle choices, and tells you to eat better. Except the patient is the entire planet, the doctor has 191 member countries to manage, and the lifestyle choices include invading neighboring countries and closing strategic waterways. The report is published twice a year, April and October, with updates in January and July. It tracks GDP projections, inflation, trade growth, and debt levels for virtually every economy on Earth. When it changes its forecast significantly, markets move. When it uses the word war in the title, markets also move, but in the other direction. The baseline for this report was built on one assumption, that the conflict in the Middle East stays short. That the Strait of Hormuz reopens. That energy markets stabilize. Under that assumption, the most optimistic one in the document, global growth comes in at 3.1% in 2026 and 3.2% in 2027. Here's the part nobody mentions. Just 3 months ago, in January 2026, the IMF was preparing to revise that number upward. The global economy had, against considerable odds, actually performed better than expected in 2025. Trade tensions had eased. Tariffs came in lower than announced. A technology investment boom, driven largely by artificial intelligence infrastructure spending, was lifting productivity. The pre-conflict forecast for 2026 was 3.4%. War ended that conversation in a matter of weeks. The world was briefly on track. That is a sentence worth sitting with. The year that almost went well. To understand where we are, you need to understand where we were. 2025 was supposed to be a bad year. The IMF's April 2025 World Economic Outlook had cut the global growth forecast to 2.8%, a significant downgrade, because of a tariff war. The United States had imposed sweeping tariffs on imports from virtually every trading partner. The IMF described effective tariff rates at levels not seen in a century. Global trade growth was projected to be cut in half, from 3.8% in 2024 to 1.7% in 2025. Supply chains were being redrawn. Business confidence had collapsed. The fund projected U.S. growth at 1.8%, with roughly 0.4 percentage points of that decline attributable directly to tariff impacts. And then, somehow, the year did not go as badly as feared. Tariffs were partially walked back. Fiscal support in several countries provided a buffer. Financial conditions remained favorable. The AI investment boom was real. Data centers, semiconductor fabrication, infrastructure build-out, and it translated into measurable productivity gains. The private sector adapted. Businesses found new routes, new suppliers, new arrangements. By the end of 2025, global growth had come in at 3.4%. Better than projected. Better than 2024 in some measures. This matters because it means the world entered 2026 with momentum. With policy buffers partially rebuilt. With central banks having successfully navigated a disinflation, bringing inflation down from post-pandemic highs without triggering the recession many economists had predicted was inevitable. The IMF had called it a major policy success. And then, on February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched strikes on Iran. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. And every number from the paragraph above became a historical footnote. The Strait of Hormuz. You've heard of this waterway. You will keep hearing of it. It sits between Iran and Oman, approximately 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. It carries roughly 20% of the world's oil trade through it on any given day. 1/5 of all the oil that moves globally, through a channel narrow enough that you can see the other side on a clear day. When that channel closes, the problem is not just symbolic. It is logistical, physical, and immediate. Tankers cannot pass. Oil that was moving from the Persian Gulf to refineries in Asia, Europe, and North America stops moving. Supply falls. Prices rise. Every country that uses oil, which is all of them, absorbs the shock at the pump, in factories, in grocery stores, and power bills. The IMF's reference forecast assumes oil prices average $82.22 a barrel in 2026, a moderate increase, premised on the conflict being short-lived. But Gourinchas made a striking observation. Even if the war ended tonight, even if a ceasefire held and the strait reopened tomorrow, the world would still face an oil shortfall for the year. The damage to drilling and refining facilities, the disruption to logistics, the insurance repricing on shipping, these do not reverse instantly. The adverse scenario, a longer conflict, sharper energy price spikes, rising inflation expectations, some tightening of financial conditions, projects global growth at 2.5% and inflation at 5.4%. The severe scenario, oil and gas prices 100 to 200% above January levels, persisting into 2027, brings global growth down to 2%. 2% is the IMF's informal threshold for a global recession. It has been crossed 4 times since 1980. The 1982 recession, the 1991 Gulf War recession, the 2009 financial crisis, 2020 and COVID. 4 times in 45 years. The IMF is not predicting a 5th. But it published a document explaining exactly how that 5th one could happen, under what conditions and at what oil price. That is a different kind of warning. Here's the part nobody mentions. The irony is almost architectural. The world spent all of 2025 navigating one self-inflicted economic crisis, the tariff war, and came out the other side better than expected. It rebuilt some confidence. It replenished some buffers. The pre-conflict forecast for 2026 had been revised upward. And then, just as the numbers were improving, a different crisis arrived. Not a tariff this time, but a war. Not a disruption to trade policy, but a disruption to the physical infrastructure through which 1/5 of the world's oil supply moves. The world managed to escape one wound and walked directly into another one. The window for a smooth adjustment, as the IMF phrased it, was narrowing. Who pays and who profits? Not every economy absorbs this shock equally. The distribution of pain follows geography, energy dependence, and fiscal capacity, which is a technical way of saying it falls hardest on countries that can least afford it. Emerging market and developing economies are projected to grow at 3.9% in 2026, down from 4.2% forecast in January. These economies tend to import energy. Their debt is often denominated in dollars. When global uncertainty rises, capital flows away from them. Investors sell emerging market assets and move into perceived safe havens, typically U.S. Treasuries. That capital flight weakens their currencies, makes their dollar-denominated debt more expensive to service, and reduces their room to spend on anything else, including shielding their populations from rising energy costs. The IMF's chief economist described the dollar appreciation that followed the war's outbreak as modest by historical standards. For a country carrying heavy foreign currency debt, modest dollar appreciation and manageable crisis are phrases that look very different from Washington than from the finance ministry trying to close next year's budget. The Middle East and Central Asia region is projected to grow at only 1.9% in 2026, a 2 percentage point downgrade. Several economies in the region are projected to contract outright, including Iran, Qatar, Iraq, Kuwait, and Bahrain. This is notable because these are predominantly energy exporters. One might expect them to benefit from higher oil prices. They do not, because the war damaged their own production infrastructure, disrupted their own exports, elevated insurance costs on their own shipping, and collapsed tourism and business investment in the region simultaneously. The eurozone is projected to grow at 1.1%. Europe has been through this before. Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine disrupted natural gas supplies across the continent and pushed inflation to its highest level since the 1970s. European households spent 2 years absorbing that shock. Many governments subsidized energy bills, accumulating debt in the process. Those buffers are thinner now. Countries in Asia that depend heavily on Gulf oil supplies scrambled to implement short-term subsidies and fuel allocation measures as prices rose. From Bangkok to Bangladesh, households faced queues for cooking gas and surging fuel costs. These are not abstractions. They are the material conditions under which billions of people operate, in economies that have very limited ability to absorb another shock. There is one beneficiary worth naming. Russia, an energy exporter under heavy international sanctions since 2022, stands to gain economically from higher oil prices regardless of how this conflict evolves. The IMF upgraded its Russia forecast to 1.1% growth. The country that triggered the last global energy shock by invading Ukraine is now being partially compensated by an energy shock triggered by an entirely different war in an entirely different part of the world. This is not editorializing. This is just arithmetic. The central bank dilemma nobody wants to explain. Here is where the policy problem becomes genuinely difficult, and where most coverage stops. When energy prices rise sharply, inflation rises with them. The standard tool for fighting inflation is to raise interest rates. Higher rates reduce borrowing, reduce spending, reduce demand, and eventually reduce prices. Central banks used this tool aggressively in 2022 and 2023 to bring post-pandemic inflation under control. It worked, mostly without triggering a global recession. The problem is that the same tool that fights inflation also slows growth. And the world is already projected to grow at only 3.1%, the reference scenario, the optimistic one. Raising interest rates in that environment pushes growth lower. It increases the cost of servicing government debt at a moment when many governments are already running large deficits. And it hits emerging markets disproportionately hard, because rate hikes in advanced economies trigger capital outflows, currency depreciation, and higher borrowing costs in countries that have no control over those decisions. The IMF is telling central banks to stay vigilant on inflation while simultaneously warning that growth is fragile and fiscal space is limited. Both of those instructions are correct. They are also, in practice, in direct tension with each other. The central bank that moves too early to fight inflation chokes growth. The one that waits too long loses credibility, and inflation expectations become unanchored, meaning people start assuming that prices will keep rising, which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The IMF's advice for navigating this is, essentially, to thread a needle that gets smaller the longer the conflict continues. What the IMF actually wants. The IMF publishes forecasts. It also publishes recommendations. This edition calls for countries to resist overspending to shield consumers from high energy prices. It calls on central banks to protect their independence. It calls for multilateral coordination. It calls for structural reforms to address long-term fiscal vulnerabilities. But it adds one recommendation that did not make most headlines. Gourinchas said the war should spur faster adoption of renewable energy, not as an environmental argument, but as a structural resilience argument. Every country that depends on fossil fuels imported through a single choke point is economically hostage to whatever happens at that choke point. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide. One conflict, one closure, 1 week of disruption, and the IMF is publishing scenarios in which global growth falls to 2%. The energy transition is, among other things, a geopolitical insurance policy. The premiums are real. The alternative, apparently, is this. The number that matters. The number is 2%. That is the informal floor. The 4 global recessions since 1980, 1982, 1991, 2009, 2020, all involved global growth at or below 2%. The reference scenario puts 2026 at 3.1%. The adverse scenario puts it at 2.5%. The severe scenario puts it at 2%. The difference between those scenarios is essentially one variable: the duration and intensity of this war, and how quickly energy production and shipping through the Strait of Hormuz normalize once it ends. At the time of publication, the IMF noted a temporary ceasefire had been reported. Gourinchas wrote that some damage is already done, and the downside risks remain elevated. A temporary ceasefire. In a war that was not supposed to happen. Threatening a global recession that was not supposed to be possible. In an economy that had, just months earlier, been on track to beat expectations. The next WEO update will be published in July. Between now and then, the strait will be navigated or not. The oil shortfall will work its way through supply chains, fuel prices, grocery bills, and central bank decisions. Governments will decide how much of the shock to absorb and how much to pass on to households. Households will decide how much they can absorb before something breaks. The IMF will continue publishing forecasts. The world will continue reading them and mostly continuing as before. The checkup is done. The results are in. The doctor is recommending multilateral cooperation and structural reform. The patient is checking the price of gas on the way home.